So this first method I call the shape method, for lack of a better name. It's just a very graphic way to start. It starts graphic, but then it becomes quite rendered and realistic, depending on obviously how much you want to refine and render, but this is more about process. So once you have your drawing, I would just take a hard edge brush or a lasso tool, whatever you use to make a hard edge shape, because that's the key here. And there's three shapes we want to first make. Number one is the shape of the object. Now, depending on the subject matter, you will need to be neat as needed. Obviously, this is a fruit, so I don't need to be very neat and precise with the shape. But if it was maybe a piece of fabric or a costume detail of a character, you will need to be more accurate with the shape. So I'll call this object. The next shape is the shape of the shadow. So for this, I'm going to pick a slightly darker tone. And the brightness, well, let me brighten it a little bit. The brightness of your object will be determined by the brightness of your the local color of the form. So now what I'm doing is the shape of the shadow. And that's this shape here. Now here there's bounce light coming in, so it's polluting this reference here. It's a wonderful reference. So I'm just going to interpret that shadow. You can kind of see it here, the plane change here. So I'm just going to interpret that there. And again, hard edge shapes, I'm using a hard edge brush. This could also be done with the lasso. Just kind of, give me a shape to give me the read of form lighting. Form shadow is what this is. So that's why you want to work with form lighting when you do your studies. It's the first lighting to master, to give you an understanding of light, shadow, and form, specifically form lighting. One light source. Okay, so that's the shape of the shadow. And the next is the background. In this case, I'm going to use just a simple paint bucket just to fill a rectangle. And I'm going to choose a value in this case. Let's try a midtone. Now, the shape of the value or the color of the tone of the background can be open to interpretation. In this case, it's dark. So I'm just going to fill it in for now as a dark, as a midtone. Eventually, I will make my adjustments, which we'll do next. Okay, next. Now I can use the clipping mask in Photoshop if you're using other program. It's basically an alpha channel or mask to add variation. So, for example, start with the shadow. I'm going to do a clip here, and I'm just going to grab a random soft airbrush. And what I'm going to do is make variation in value, and you can also add variation in texture, which you also do want to do, especially if it's a character like a costume piece or an environment especially. That's really all I wanted to do here, is add some subtle variation to the shadow. See that? And it's because it's clipped here. Now if I unclip it, it spills out. But you can also use an alpha channel like so in Photoshop or other programs like Procreate. Basically just to mask it to that shape. Do the same thing for the object. Add some subtle variation tone. It's going to be a little bit darker here and a little bit brighter at the light. And we're not rendering here, we're just adding a little bit of variation just to give some variety, some spice, and much more realism. And I'll just briefly show you what you can do. We'll do this on another layer with texture, just briefly. It's not 100% necessary, especially if you're just practicing. I don't have quite the right texture brush. I'll just use this little brush here. Undo that. And I'll use a real light opacity just to give it some little bit of a little dot texture. And I'm going to drop the opacity. So just an example of what you can do with texture there. Finally, variation in the background. Real simple, same idea. Big airbrush. You can even use the gradient tool in Photoshop to create a big sweep. What I'm going to do is just for now, I'm going to make the background slightly darker. So make the light side pop out. And maybe a little slightly brighter here. A little bit brighter here. Just some variations. Very crude, very simple, just for this demonstration. But you can see the possibilities, what you can do with texture, different brushes and things. Okay, so that's variation. Okay, next step is to soften the edges. So transition from shadow to light. And really all you need to do that is a softer brush, right? So for example, what I'm going to do is color pick this value. It's at 33%. And I'm just going to use a soft airbrush. You can use a variety of soft brushes, softer brushes, just to kill that hard edge, soften that hard edge, help that form turn. This is a organic form. It's an apple. So you see, now we soften that edge. Looks pretty nice there. And what I could also do now is to add while I'm here, is add the bounce light. To do that, can darken the core shadow. So remember, if you want to create the illusion of bounce light, this is the Terminator here. It's here on our reference. It's better to darken the core shadow than it is to brighten the actual bounce light. Add a brighter value into the bounce light. You want to be very careful with that. That's more of a rendering discussion there. It's for another day. Okay, we got that. And while I'm here, I'm going to also darken the occlusion shadow. This part of the shadow right here is known as the occlusion shadow. It's really dark. In fact, I can even darken the whole shadow itself to add more contrast, but it's not totally necessary. And I could also slightly soften the cast shadow. Just do it manually here. You could also use a blur in Photoshop. That would be a much faster way to do it. It's probably what I would do if this was like a more of an illustration job. If I was in the studio and I had a deadline, I would use something like that. So that's basically the principle. You want to soften your hard edges. And finally, we're going to add the highlight. We got our shadow in place. We're going to add our highlight. I'm just going to color pick this value here and go to a slightly brighter value. What I'm going to do is try to build it up slowly, if I can. And again, this is not a rendering exercise, just more of a process. And finally, the bright highlight, go to almost near white. And that's really about it. And of course, we can, render and refine as much as needed. We can darken the background. Obviously, the background's on a layer. You can darken the background and do all sorts of things. You can, come back in and draw, refine the shape, but that's more of a rendering. But this is just a demonstration, quick demonstration of one process. Now, just a quick note. Obviously, if you have multiple shapes, let's say you have a character and a piece of fabric, you will need this layer, the object layer, the shape layer. You'll need two shapes. So each, let's say it's a character and a t-shirt, or a character and a pair of pants. It would have its own object, and it would have its own masks and clips to it. So just quickly, as an example, let's say I want, I'm just going to get rid of that, the stem. Let's say I want the stem to be its own unique object. So I would just repeat the process. Use a hard edge brush at first, or a lasso. Let me use a lasso since I'm in Photoshop here. But you can do this with a hard edge brush like we did. All right, and then just fill it with the shape, with the color, with the tone. So in this case, the local color of the stem is darker. I'm going to make it a little bit darker. Oh, there's some rendering that came through here. And I'm going to call this stem flat, stem shape. And same thing, add variation to it. Add a little bit darker, because the stem doesn't need to be as rendered as, say, the apple. So on a character, let's say this was the shoes. The shoes don't need to be as rendered or as accurate, as pretty as the face or the body. So you wouldn't need to, I don't need to spend that much attention, but you can see how now we have two things, one object but two different layers, the flat of the apple and the stem. So now, that's the stem would need its own shadow as well. So I can go back and add shadow. I can also give it a unique shadow shape, clip to it, and things like that. You can even just render on top. But it's just a demonstration that if you have one subject that has multiple items on it that need to be separated in the shapes, that's all you would have to do. Okay, so that's an example of the shape, layers, and masking method.